Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm Kevin Gostola, and I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Ann Wright and Matthew Hoh. First, I'll introduce Ann is a retired U.S. Army colonel who spent 29 years in the U.S. Army, then 16 years in the U.S. State Department as a diplomat before resigning in 2003 in opposition to the war in Iraq. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Kevin.
And then Matthew is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, a member of the Eisenhower Media Network. He served in the Marine Corps in Iraq, and he resigned from the State Department over the war in Afghanistan. And you might have seen him recently. You seem to have gotten around your blacklisting on MSNBC.
Yeah, but as some people thanks, Kevin. But as some people pointed out, the Free Assange poster on my wall behind me is probably not going to help me get back on anytime soon. And also, to be fair, it wasn't the pure MSNBC; it was Peacock, so it was their streaming, right? So
yes.
The proverbial poor man's version of MSNBC, I guess you will. And it was with Mehdi Hassan, and Mehdi Hassan has actually been really good on a lot of these issues. He's actually been quite good. He has been supportive of Assange, other things against the wars, kind of one of the better journalists out there on the American networks.
So it's MSNBC with an asterisk next to it. So all right. Well, we talked to you, and Rania was with me. She's taking a much needed break, and it's unfortunate she can't join this conversation. But we had you on a little more than a month ago, back in July. We hadn't seen this massive evacuation effort undertaken. And I suppose before we get it, I wanted to start off with playing a clip because I think it sets up a lot of the issues, or at least gives you something to react. But first, I'll ask each of you. I'll go ahead and start with Ann, and then Matt, you can answer as well. It seems like this is unprecedented in history for us to essentially assist or be able to remain in a country where it's mostly accepted we've lost the conflict. We didn't achieve the mission, so to speak, or we achieved a mission, but the task of continuing to build this nation is one that has collapsed entirely. And we've seen who was our declared enemy, the Taliban, march on us. And rather than them crushing us and running us out of Kabul, they decide to allow a coordination effort where we're able to evacuate and essentially do a brain drain on their country and remove some of their best people from Afghanistan. And yes, it's so they can be safe and so they're not attacked by them later, but also it doesn't seem like it's really in the Taliban's interest to let all of these people out of their country necessarily, unless they just believe this is going to build goodwill. But I don't know of any conflict where you've been able to remain and conduct a 2-week, maybe a little bit more than that, evacuation of people and actually cooperate with who was your enemy on the battlefield and have the kind of success that the United States had. Maybe I have the wrong outlook on this, but I mean, Ann, what's your viewpoint?
Well, I think if you go back to the war on Vietnam, the peace agreement that the U.S. signed with the North Korean or North Vietnamese government happened 2 years before the takeover of Saigon. And so there was an evacuation out of Saigon. It was a hectic evacuation, as we remember from the pictures of the people climbing up the ladder to get on top of one particular building. It actually wasn't an embassy building, as it turned out. It was an apartment building. And when you go to Saigon now, they will point out all of these places that were a part of the evacuation. The Viet Cong and the NVA allowed an evacuation of certain people. There are books that have been written about convoys of U.S. military trucks taking large numbers of people out to the airport to fly them out. Of course, there were a lot of Vietnamese that were left behind that knew that their lives were going to be very difficult, just as Afghans right now. And that's where you had the massive boat people, where tens of thousands, probably up to about a 250,000 people, went out of Vietnam by boat and were picked up by U.S. military boats that were offshore. And this was over a period of a year. I helped with the Vietnamese resettlement project, which occurred in 1975, and 4 military bases, just as today, 4 military bases are being used to house now Afghan refugees, but at the time it was Vietnamese and Indochina refugees, because it just wasn't the Vietnamese, although they were the primary, but there were Cambodians, Laotians. And over a period of 6 months, we had over 130,000 people that cycled through these 4 military bases. I was at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and we had a constant population of 30,000 people that we were providing World War II barracks, food, 5 massive mess halls that were cooking up more rice than you could ever imagine, and medical facilities. And as refugee agencies, just as today, as refugee agencies come to the bases and say, okay, we've now got so-and-so community in Iowa, and they can take 3 families, and the Lutheran Refugee Services, Catholic Refugee Services, whatever, would take those little families and off they would go. And then we'd get another plane load of people that were coming in and starting the process that might take anywhere from a week to a month. So that's kind of a long answer to your very first question. My apologies.
Yeah, it reminds me, Anne's conversation there, discussion about the Vietnamese reminds me when I was in high school, every day in high school, this was in the late 80s, I ate lunch with my friend, Tam Tran, who was one of those people who was put in a boat in 1975 and made it to the United States. It also reminds me too, and Kevin, you live in the DC area, correct?
Chicago.
Oh, Chicago. I'm sorry. I oh my God, the fact that I just compared DC to Chicago, like you should just block me for the rest of this conversation. Apologies to everyone in Chicago.
I try to stay out of the bubble.
Oh my God, Chicago, one of the best cities in America, if not the world, and DC, not that. But anyway, right outside of DC, there's a big shopping area in Northern Virginia called the Eden Center, which is, I think, the largest Vietnamese shopping center on the East Coast and the second largest Vietnamese shopping center in the United States. And they still fly the flag of the Republic of South Vietnam. So they're still fighting the war. But the point is that Northern Virginia was an area that the Vietnamese were resettled in the 70s, and their contributions to that area are just massive. I mean, like they made the area better. And I think that's a point about these Afghan refugees, is I have no doubt that they will make, if they are given the resources and the opportunities and the assistance that you would expect a refugee to need, somebody just being dropped in your country, they will make this country better. I have no doubt about that. With regards to your question, though, has there ever been anything like we've seen? Like we've seen in the last month in Kabul, where the United States did this evacuation in the midst of the capital city that was taken by a victorious enemy. I think the answer is yes, and it has been in Afghanistan. Certainly, during the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan begins in 1988 and culminates in February of '89. And it's a phased withdrawal. It takes place over 9 or 10 months. And I think there was fighting between the Soviets and the Mujahideen. However, for the most part, the Soviets were allowed to withdraw in peace, if I recall correctly. And the same applied here in Afghanistan with the United States. The United States signs a Doha agreement with the Taliban February 2020, and the Taliban says we will not attack any more American forces or foreign forces, and they held that. So for 18 months, the United States was in Afghanistan doing this withdrawal, doing this retreat without being attacked by the Taliban. I mean, to put it even further, the Washington Post reports that after Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, fled, and literally Kabul became a city without a government, and Afghanistan a country without a government overnight. The Washington Post reports that the Taliban offered to the American military for for the American military to take control of Kabul until the Taliban stood up an interim government. And we also know that coming from the American military, that the Taliban were the ones protecting the American troops in those final days of the retreat, in those final days of the evacuation. It was strictly Taliban forces that were protecting the Americans as they were loading up the last of the troops, the last of their equipment, doing whatever to get out. And also reports that the Taliban stopped terror attacks against the United States and the evacuation during this last few weeks. Certainly, there is no way the evacuation could have occurred in the way it did with only one suicide bomber strike and a few rockets fired at the airport, if not for the Taliban, if not for the thousands of their men, their soldiers, as well as the cooperation of the Taliban themselves. I mean, it's very clear that the fact that you had such a mass of people, such as we would say, a target-rich environment in Kabul, stuck, at the walls of the airport, which would wonderful target for a suicide bomber. You could be, I've said this before, you could be not to belittle it, but you could be like the bad news bears of suicide bombers and still have been successful. And certainly the Islamic State was an organization that has been successful in its attacks over the last 5 years. They are well established, they're well funded, they are organized, they are very capable. So for the fact that they were only able to pull off one successful suicide bombing, as terrible and tragic as it is, goes a lot to your point about the cooperation and the coordination that occurred between the Taliban and the Americans. It also goes a lot to dispel what we actually know about the Taliban. Maybe all these experts in the United States and the West who claim that they understand the Taliban and this is why you can't negotiate with them, this is why you can't work with them. Maybe it's just one more sign that these people have no idea what they're talking about.
Now let me, I'm going to take a moment here and let's wade through some of this propaganda that we've all been subject to. And as we see with this withdrawal, we're watching recognizable characters try to set the narrative for after Afghanistan. I think it's really important that we challenge what is being said here. So the first one that I'm going to play here, and this comes from General Petraeus, your nemesis, Matthew, and it should be all of our nemesis.
Was there any version of the story that did not end with the Taliban back in charge?
Certainly there was. There was a sustained commitment that could have been pursued. 3,500 troops with a lot of drones and a lot of air power and 8,500 coalition forces, and perhaps most importantly, the contractors still on the ground to keep the Afghan Air Force flying. I think that it was really the psychological effect of our announcement of the withdrawal, then the actual withdrawal, and then very significantly the withdrawal of the contractors that kept the U.S. provided helicopters and planes in the air and showed the Afghan soldiers on the ground that there would be someone coming to the rescue with resupplies, reinforcements, and indeed with close air support. And if soldiers on the ground don't think that that is coming, then they're going to do what we have seen Afghan soldiers do.
In the end, was there a lack of understanding of how deep corruption goes in that society and how it could affect the outcome?
Well, there's no question that there has been very, very troubling corruption over the years. We created an anti-corruption task force with the Afghans when I was the commander in Afghanistan.
In general, I'm sure coming up through the officer ranks, the lessons of Vietnam were hammered into your generation of officer. Are we at a point now that we've already forgotten those lessons?
Well, my PhD dissertation, in fact, was on the impact of the lessons of Vietnam on America's military leadership.
Will you feel any sense of emptiness when we mark the 20th anniversary of September 11th, based on what we've seen transpire in Afghanistan?
It's a very interesting question, Lester, because I think I feel very differently about the prospect of that anniversary than I did, frankly, before the collapse in Afghanistan.
That's General David Petraeus, and we'll let you have a first crack at it, Matthew, and then we'll go to Ann.
I'm reminded of the scene from Airplane when Lloyd Bridges says, "I picked the wrong week to stop sniffing glue." Just the lies, the clinical pathological lying that goes on. I think this is a very serious thing, and I mean, not to, we shouldn't be making I shouldn't be making light of it. Look, sociologists tell us that 4% of society are psychopaths, and we know that psychopaths do very well in institutions and organizations. And a man like David Petraeus is a psychopath. That's clear. I mean, that's not hyperbole. I think if you were to look at what a psychopath is defined as, he meets that criteria for such a diagnosis. I mean, it's very clear. And I think we have to accept that our system has been captured by psychopaths, and it has also been emboldened, who are emboldened by a corrupt media who says things that is just not just factually untrue, but it's just myth making. The comments made by Lester Holt about the corruption, just the way that the American media is so keen on pinning the blame on the Afghans. If the Afghans are a bunch of dirty rats who didn't deserve us to begin with, they're always just going to steal from us. I mean, and all the racist undertones that come from that, right? I mean, that's certainly you see that well throughout American history. But neglecting the fact that we know that 80% of the money spent on reconstruction in Afghanistan, so 80%, at least 80% of the $150 billion or so the United States spending on reconstruction, on building up the Afghan army, et cetera, at least 80% of that made a round trip back to the United States, either never left the United States or came back to the United States. So you talk about corruption, it's so off base the way it's framed. But I mean, and Petraeus, the inconvenient leaving out of things. Look, the Afghan soldiers hadn't been paid for 6 months or so. They hadn't had food for 2 months. The Afghan government workers hadn't been paid in 6 months. The United States is spending $900 million a year, supposedly, on Afghan government salaries, including this year. Where did that money go to? It went to the very men. Well, it went to the American corporations and everything, of course. But in Afghanistan, it went to the very men that David Petraeus said were the men that we could trust, were the men that Petraeus pal around with, were the men that Petraeus sent young Americans to kill and be killed for in order to keep in power. So I mean, you look at the fact that David Petraeus failed over and over and over again. And just to stick on Petraeus for one more moment, and I'll let Ann comment. Remember, Petraeus in 2003 had command of the city of Mosul in Iraq with the 101st Air Assault Division. And when, according to Petraeus and his people in Mosul, everything was going pretty well in Mosul in 2003 into 2004. And then when the unit that came in replaced Petraeus, it was a nightmare. I mean, they just walked into a shit show. It was just violent. And the reality is that Petraeus and his people were cooking the books. And this is well documented, right? Petraeus then takes over the training command in Iraq, what was called Min-Sticky, which was responsible for building up the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army. Under his command, that training command loses 300,000 rifles and pistols. Hundreds of thousands of rifles and pistols just go missing under Petraeus's command in Iraq. Same time, too, this is when the Shia militias start to really fill out, particularly the Iraqi police, and become those death squads that really precipitate and foment and are catalyst or accelerate the genocidal civil war that is occurring in Iraq. That's under Petraeus's watch. But then you also have to, or under Petraeus's command. But then you also have to remember October 2004, Petraeus writes an op-ed, either in the Post or the New York Times, I forget which. And Petraeus basically endorses George Bush for president. Doesn't mention him by name, but you can't go back and read that op-ed without understanding it as an endorsement by the most famous general in America, because you have to remember at this point, Petraeus has been on the cover of Newsweek a couple times. At one point, the cover says, "Is this the man who can save Iraq?" I mean, he is a celebrity general. He is easily the most recognizable and trusted general in the United States since Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf, arguably the most impactful general since Westmoreland in Vietnam. And he writes this op-ed endorsing George Bush. And right, in any sane system, in any system that had any integrity, that actually valued civilian control of the military, a nonpartisan, non-political military, Petraeus would have been fired, court-martialed, most likely. But what happens? Petraeus gets promoted, and he gets promoted again. then he gets promoted again, right? Ultimately culminating to becoming director of Central Intelligence, where, of course, the Paula Broadwell affair happens. If people are not familiar with that, Petraeus was sleeping with his biographer, and as director of Central Intelligence, he was passing along top secret information to Paula Broadwell, including ongoing operations the CIA was conducting, the military was conducting, in order to, one, either help fill out his biography or impress her. And he was, of course, let off with a slap on the wrist. But I think you have to understand that. And then you understand that that's who rises to the top. Well, people like that pull people like themselves up below them, up behind them, as well as people who want to rise understand this is how I have to act to rise up. So, long explanation of this, but yeah, I think you knew, Kevin, that if you play a clip of Petraeus, you were going to get me agitated and all wound up. So well done.
All right. Anne, what would you like to add?
Well, I think Matt has pretty well covered it, but it wasn't like everybody in America agreed and didn't see through him. I can remember being thrown out of a congressional hearing as we had the banners that said not Petraeus, but betray us, and we all knew that. I mean, we knew it, but as Matt said, the mainstream media was just going bonkers for this latest hero that they could sell lots of magazines about. We also know that, by that time we knew that senior officials of Afghanistan had tremendous properties that were in Dubai and Doha. We knew that U.S. contractors were making a killing out of this. And the wealth that was returning, as Matt said, returning to the U.S. in these sole source contracts that were being issued by the military. In fact, one very courageous woman, Benatine Greenhouse, was the chief of Army contracting, and she ended up getting essentially fired because she kept raising the issue of how come I'm being ordered to give sole source contracts to groups like Halliburton, which Vice President Cheney had just come from, and all of the graft and corruption. So it was out there. People were reporting on it, but it was allowed to continue because that's just the way it was.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're enjoying this week's episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. Here is a reminder to support our show and help us keep going. You can go to Patreon or Rockfin or Spotify to support our show. So here's the links. If you want to support us on Patreon, go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. If you want to support us on Rockfin and become a subscriber of our channel, go to rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. If you'd like to support us on Spotify, pull up our show, the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast, and subscribe to our paid content. On all three spaces, you get access to full episodes and any other additional exclusive content we post every month. So thank you, and back to the show. So that's the general. That's someone who has complicity and also responsibility, but hasn't been held accountable at all for any of what's gone on in the war. Now, let's look at someone who is in a think tank, because these people populate our screens and infect our understanding. And let's.
You're killing me, Kevin. You're killing me.
No, but I think this gives people like the complete picture of who we have to deal with, because they're the ones who are writing the dominant narrative of this conflict. And unfortunately, we have our work cut out for us because we're going to spend the next decades trying to unravel what they say. But here's Richard Haass, and he's at the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, to make it even more obnoxious, we have the pairing of Joe Scarborough.
What are the ramifications for this country as we move forward in the future, for other countries who we try to get to come out and take a chance on democracy, take a chance on freedom, or at least take a chance on basic human rights, and take a chance on us believing that we'll stay there and fight and defend them?
I think what this does is it reinforces the growing narrative that the United States is not a steady, predictable, reliable hand. We saw it with Barack Obama after the red line fiasco in Syria, the intervention in Libya, and then no follow-up. We then many things in the Trump administration where he targeted U.S. allies in all sorts of ways. U.S. troop presence that had been there for generations was suddenly a big question mark over it. You mentioned the situation in Syria, now this. So again, I don't think Germans are going to wake up tomorrow and say American troops are going to leave, even though Donald Trump wanted to, or South Koreans. But I do think it raises questions about reliability, and two things are likely. One is our friends begin to hedge because American support is simply less certain. And what worries me also is some of our adversaries might think that maybe the United States is not as dependable. Maybe now's the time to press. Maybe now's the time to explore what we can get away with, because this is clearly in America that's totally focused domestically, and that clearly seems to have very little interest in maintaining a kind of a large world role, or even a medium-sized world role for much longer. So it feeds a narrative, and that's what concerns me. One other.
All right. Well, we will start with Anne for this one.
Well, Richard Haas and I have a little bit of a background. When I resigned, before I resigned in 2003, I wrote a dissent cable to the State Department, laying out all my views. Essentially, it was the predecessor to my resignation letter, but laying out all of my problems with what the Bush administration was doing leading up to a war on Iraq, and also other foreign policy concerns that I had, including essentially icing out North Korea, where we did have some contacts and could have kept talking with them about a potential their nuclear research program, and also the curtailment of civil liberties, all of that. Well, so my dissent cable came to Washington, and it was Richard Haas, who was the head of he was the director of policy planning, which is the group that will respond to people out in the field that are saying, you guys in Washington don't know what you're doing, and here's my idea of what we ought to do. Like, don't invade Iraq, an oil-rich Arab Muslim country that had not attacked the United States, had nothing to do with 9/11, so don't do it. So here came back from Richard Haas this paltry little thing of, well, we know better, and all you have to do is read our press releases every day, and that will give you the background on why we know what we're doing. It wasn't until several years later, like probably after 2008, when the Bush administration was out of power, that Richard Haas finally said, perhaps we were incorrect in our analysis of Iraq. Well, Richard Haas has been incorrect on a lot of things, but he gets paid a lot. He's got a big name, and these think tanks just keep hiring these people that have been wrong in their assessments, and virtually never giving voice to people like Matt Hoh, who has been correct on these things.
Yeah, the think tanks. Well, first, let's go back to what Haas says. And again, another liar, another person who builds their argument upon lies which they know they are arguing for. Just take the red that he talks about Obama allowing Syria to get away with crossing the red line of chemical weapons. Well, I mean, Barack Obama himself said that there was not enough evidence to justify military strikes in Syria, that the United States intelligence community could not confirm that Assad launched that chemical attack. And this, of course, has been confirmed again, right, by journalist accounts, as well as, the leaks from the OPCW whistleblowers. But, Barack Obama says this. James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, confirms it. Obama says this in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic. I mean, so not an opposition or adversarial establishment. Not adversarial to the establishment at all, the Atlantic, and Haas just chooses to ignore that, and Scarborough is an idiot, so he's not going to know anything different, and he's surrounded by sycophants. I mean, I think we have to, because we are at the end of 20 years of people being massacred, the slaughter, the destruction. I think we have to use words that are very firm in describing these people. Joe Scarborough is an idiot. I mean, he is. I mean, that's, maybe I could choose my words better, but in terms of someone who speaks without knowing what they're talking about, that is exactly what Scarborough is. The think tanks are very dangerous. They're very well funded. There's a cyclical relationship with Congress, the Pentagon, and the think tanks. The Congress appropriates money to the Pentagon and to the State Department, the CIA, and other organizations. The bulk of that money goes out to arms companies, development companies, intelligence contractors, whatever. Those people, those companies and contractors then fund these think tanks. A lot of these think tanks are also funded directly by the United States government, by the Pentagon, by the State Department, by the National Security Council, et cetera. These think tanks are also funded by foreign governments. And let me tell you, as a disabled combat veteran who, realized, who got the guts too late to stand up against these wars, but who understands them, it's hard to articulate what it feels like because I'm around these people. When someone from a think tank that's funded by foreign governments and by weapons companies says to me, "Thank you for your service," it's really hard to articulate what that makes me feel. But you have to understand how well funded these think tanks are. They break down, they support various elements within the various factions of the empire. So you have, like, say, supporting the neoconservatives or the GOP neoconservatives. You have the Institute for Study of War. Supporting, like, the liberal interventionists within the Obama administration and Biden administration. You have the Center for New American Security, supporting, like, the Trump generals, Mattis, Kelly, McMaster, those types. You have Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which the last numbers I've seen for it, 2019, had $32 million in funding for a think tank of a dozen, 2 dozen people, $32 million. I mean, so they're very capable, they're very well resourced, and they have access. I meeting with Senator Bob Casey's staff in 2012. I was told by one of his staffers, who actually was a military officer, a U.S. Army major, that 7 out of 10 briefings that the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee receive do not come from U.S. government organizations or agencies like the CIA or the State Department or the Pentagon, but rather 7 out of 10 briefings that they receive come from think tanks like Foundation for Defense of Democracy, Institute for Study of War, CNAS. So these are very important, and they're very integral to the continuance of these wars at all levels, right? Funding, operations, narrative, propaganda, public support, political support, et cetera.
And so that's the think tanker who's polluting our understanding. The last one, I promise, there's no more clips, Matt. I'm sorry that I did this to you. But this is the journalist. Well, we have to work in someone who I guess I mock him by saying I offer my condolences for the loss of his war, as did several other people. But this is Richard Engel of NBC.
Richard Engel, your thoughts to what you just heard from General McKenzie announcing the end of the 20-year war in Afghanistan?
Well, these are heavy days. I don't know any way other to describe it. I do not envy him for having had to make that statement, to speak to the American people, but also to speak to others who served in Afghanistan, including his own family members, and to tell them that we came, we fought, and we're leaving, and we're handing over the country back to the same enemy, and that we coordinated with the enemy so that they could make sure we packed up and left on time. It is a moment of deep humility. The United States has been humbled today. It is another empire that has not fallen in Afghanistan, but that has stumbled in Afghanistan. The British Empire fought in Afghanistan and pulled out in defeat, as did the Soviet Union, and now the United States as well. Mission. There hadn't been any troops killed in Afghanistan in about 2 years, and the costs had been reduced significantly. There was about 3,500 troops there that were holding it together, who weren't dying, and with their withdrawal, you saw quickly the collapse of the entire country. There's going to be a lot of debate whether that was the right decision. Most Afghans do not think it was the right decision. Most Afghans never saw those American troops, did not feel occupied by those American troops, felt comforted by their presence, and their withdrawal emboldened the Taliban, as did the deal signed by President Trump.
What a fraud. I mean, what an absolute fraud. Again, another person who just simply does not know what they're talking about. I mean, the idea that the United States did not feel the occupation, as if this war was somehow not affecting Afghans, was not a continuance of 40 years of warfare, was not devastating them, that somehow this war hadn't just completely destroyed the country, where 90% of the population lives on less than $2 a day, which is the poverty rate for Afghanistan. And actually 70% of the population lives on less than $1 a day, where Afghanistan is the second most food insecure country in the world. And even before the Taliban took over, the country was on the brink of starvation and was in economic collapse, not on the verge of economic collapse. And somehow Richard Engel states that the people didn't feel the occupation, let alone the violence, the slaughter, I mean, it boggles the mind that he could say something like that. I mean, it is just absolutely fraudulent. I think NBC and CNN have been among the worst in terms of their coverage. CNN with, contrast Clarissa Ward's coverage on CNN with Charlotte Bellis' coverage on Al Jazeera. And if you do that, if you look literally at the reporting they made at the same time from the same place, Kabul, you will truly understand what the concept of manufacturing consent actually means, because these American media networks did nothing but sustain narrative and propaganda, as well as, again, just be completely wrong. The reason why no American troops died in the last 18 months, because there was a peace deal with the Taliban. Like, what don't they get about that? Why do they choose to ignore that? Either they're too dumb, Kevin, or they're in on it. Because how can you say no Americans died in the last 18 months without saying it was because of a negotiated deal with the Taliban? The only way you could say that is either because you're too dumb to know that, or the fact that you're in on it and you want to continue this war because, for whatever reason, again, Richard Engel is another one of these psychopaths who thinks that blood is better, who thinks that violence is better, who thinks that, it doesn't matter if and this feeds into the whole structure of how American warfare has evolved over particularly these last 10 years since the Obama administration, where these wars are hidden, where as long as it's just black people killing black people, brown people killing brown people, it doesn't matter to the American public, doesn't matter to the American Congress, and obviously doesn't matter to the American media, or at least it doesn't matter to NBC News, because these are just brown people killing brown people. They've always been killing each other. What are you going to do with these savages? I mean, that's the attitude you get from that. And that is the actual, that is the consequences of these policies, and the fact that you have a media that is complicit with these, war policies.
Anne, anything you'd like to add?
Well, if I could add, you could see Richard Engel almost crying about the end of his war career. That so many correspondents have made a name for themselves of being the reporters on the ground. That's the way we got introduced to them, like Christiane Amanpour in the Gulf War I. That's where she got her start. And so the fact that these reporters really want a war, because that's where they can get international recognition, where they can go and be in danger, and their voices are heard throughout the world. Whereas covering the economic conditions of Belgium, that doesn't really ring so strongly with networks and trying to make your name for yourself. So the war reporters are, I would think, pretty sad when they see yet one more of the mistakes of the United States coming to an end. However, I would say to them that the U.S. probably has not learned its lesson, and that there will be other tragedies that the U.S. military will be getting into, because the politicians think that war is the answer and that military operations are much better than diplomacy. So these war correspondents are a fact that really should be, the American public ought to take a deep breath and say, why are they reporting the way it is? And let's get some other information. Like on my computer every day, I've got 3 or 4 different news outlets that are ready to roll, so I can just do the live streaming. And whether it's Al Jazeera or whether it's Russia Today, which I do watch for sure, or of course, Democracy Now! That has good coverage and of things. But we can't rely on our networks, because they are complicit with our government in how wars are portrayed to the American public and to the world.
And before we move away from the media, I want to show you this amazing graphic that was put together by Media Matters, which just let me scroll up a little bit here. We see this spike. This is a graph of how the coverage for Afghanistan started, and then all through the entire 20-year conflict, and how you see a bit of a spike around the surge, when that was obviously a big political issue. Obviously, all the military contractors and the generals are pushing for the surge, but it just doesn't even compare to the start of the war. And then at the end, actually, the withdrawal here equals the narrative manufacturing of the start of the war. So the justification of the invasion. But, what we've all heard isn't a defense of Biden's actions. It's not a defense of the administration's withdrawal. It's been throughout the whole last month a kind of trolling of every intention that Biden and his administration seems to have to pull people out of this country. So I just wanted to add that there. I don't know if anybody has anything they wanted to say to that.
Yeah, it goes along with it. There's a media critic named Andrew Tyndall, Tyndall, and he tracks all kinds of television media, television news. And, he has a graph on his website you can find that shows the coverage of Afghanistan by the network nightly news. So ABC, CBS, NBC. NBC is who Richard Engel reports for. And if you look at this graph, you will see that, say for the last 6 years, through the years 2015 through 2020. So that nightly network news coverage over those 6 years has been less than 5 minutes a year, right? So each network does 365 broadcasts a year of their nightly news. During the last 6 years, up until this year, less than 5 minutes each year was covered by the networks on Afghanistan. I mean, so literally no coverage of Afghanistan by the net. And the importance of the network nightly news, it is still by far, the ABC, CBS, NBC nightly news, by far is the largest source of national and international news coverage that for many Americans. I mean, the amount of people who watch the nightly news broadcasts as opposed to watching CNN or Fox or MSNBC or Democracy Now! Or whatever is there's millions and millions of difference. I mean, not talking about the opinions of Rachel Maddow's, the Sean Hannity's, but just in terms of news coverage, this is where millions of families get their news from, way more than any other source. And you see that there's been almost no coverage in the preceding 6 years, let alone 20 years, about Afghanistan by the networks. And then what you have then, of course, is with this explosion of coverage, you have people getting shocked by it, right? Because if you haven't heard about it, then you kind of think maybe things are going well. What's happening? What did Biden do to cause this? And meanwhile, the war has just been worse and worse every year. The violence has gotten worse every year. There's never any progress or stability or advancement. So the excuse me. But the good thing is that we're taping today on a Friday the 3rd. So if people want to look this up, the Washington Post has a poll today that shows 76% of Americans still support the overall withdrawal. It's some crazy 25% support the withdrawal and think the last few weeks went well. 50% still support the withdrawal, but think the last few weeks could have gone differently or they weren't handled well, which is just really infantile because this is what losing looks like. When do you get to choose? I mean, how do you lose and get to choose how you're going to lose? I mean, this is what losing looks like. And as we said earlier, the fact that the Taliban were so cooperative means things could have been a lot worse. But so as of today in a Washington Post poll, even with this media coverage, this media saturation, 70%, 76% of Americans still believe it was the right decision to get out of Afghanistan, which more or less matches up with polling going back to as far as 2006, as I can tell. That so for the last 15 years or so, either a majority or an even amount of Americans have supported getting out of Afghanistan, have said the war is not worth it for the last 15 years. So the idea that somehow Americans are against this war all of a sudden is just not true. And I remember in 2012, 2013 around, people were so opposed to the war in Afghanistan that it became the most unpopular war of all time in American history, where almost 80% of Americans were in favor of getting out of Afghanistan, which was a much greater number of people who ever thought about getting out of Iraq or who ever thought about getting out of Vietnam.
Once again, here's a reminder to support the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by going to our Patreon or Rockfin or finding us on Spotify. On Patreon, we're at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. On Rockfin, you can subscribe to our channel at rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. And on Spotify, all you have to do is find our show, Unauthorized Disclosure, and become a paid subscriber. So thank you, and back to the show. All right, before we started, you talked about the CIA, and I think it's really crucial here as we look forward to what's going to happen in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawing these forces. You know, what is the CIA doing? What were they even doing while the U.S. was mounting this evacuation? And let's start with you, and then Matt can add to whatever you have to say about the CIA.
The first U.S. into Afghanistan were not U.S. military, they were CIA. And it was CIA that really had the largest presence. Even when I got there in December of 2001, it was the CIA that was running the show. It wasn't the U.S. military. They had their paramilitary in there, which includes aircraft, helicopters. They have their own operatives that still had contact with the groups of people that they had supported during the war against the Soviets and had kept in touch with during the Civil War that happened between the various factions that the U.S. had supported. After they had kicked the Soviets out, then the militias started fighting among themselves, and that's really where most of the damage was done to the city of Kabul. It wasn't in any war against the Soviets, it was the war among the militias, which I think we should anticipate is going to happen again now that the Taliban are in charge, but still these CIA militias are out there. And to talk specifically about what was happening during the evacuation, you know, the CIA had a very, very large compound in Kabul. It was called Eagle Base, and it had its own helicopter port. It was the site of that infamous Salt prison where so many tortures occurred in 2001 and 2002, and we know about them because some of the prisoners that ended up in Bagram and in Guantanamo and that have been released, you know, over 770 people were put into Guantanamo over the years. There are 39 of them that are left, and many of those that were released have told us about the CIA prison in the Salt prison. Well, the Eagle Base had helicopters in it in August, and when the evacuation started, there were over 35 flights, as reported by the New York Times, 35 helicopter flights that were ferrying people from the base, which is located quite near the airport, ferrying people into the airport. So one would assume that was one of the places where the U.S. government was telling Afghans that they wanted to help out to go to that base, and then they would get in CIA helicopters and be flown into to the air base. That includes some of the CIA militias, notorious militias. The militias called, I believe it was NDS 0, and there were NDS 0K, which was Kandahar, and 2 or 3 others that were notorious for their night raids and for their brutality toward the Afghan people. The brutality extended apparently during the evacuation, where some of these militias were beating up Afghans that were trying to come into to get evacuated, but it wasn't necessarily always the Taliban that was beating people up, according to reports that we're now getting, but it was the U.S.-sponsored militias that were beating people up.
You know, with regards to these NDS units, these 0 units, as Ann said, they're incredibly brutal. Very effective, though, in terms of terrorizing people, and that was much of the strategy of the United States since General Petraeus took over in 2011 after General McChrystal was fired. Was this, shift to counterterrorism strategy, which not a lot of big differences between what happened before and what then, but part of it was this terror campaign. Landing helicopters in the middle of the night in villages, kicking in doors, shooting people, taking them away and then torturing them. And part of that was expanding that to have Afghans doing it. And certainly the CIA NDS units, of which there's anywhere between 10 and 25,000 members, we just don't really know, were part of it. And so they ended up, it's interesting because Ann and I are on the same, we're in a WhatsApp group with a number of other like-minded folks. And several weeks ago, this was a question that we had for each other. Has anyone seen any reporting on what the CIA units are doing? And then lo and behold, they are outside the airport beating people, extorting them for money. I can guarantee you that people like Clarissa Ward at CNN and Richard Engel at NBC were reporting what the NDS were doing as what the Taliban were doing. Because brown people are brown people, right? I mean, like that's how that reporting basically comes across. So what you see is that many of these warlords that the U.S. has been partners with, going back to the 80s, or actually the 70s, actually, are holding out against the Taliban. Today is Friday, the 3rd, as we said before. And so the news today is that the Panjshir Valley, where the kind of the most consolidated resistance to the Taliban, the part that the Taliban had not either outright conquered or made deals with, had fallen today. And it fell without much of a fight. I mean, a few days of fighting, but really not much. And the Panjshir Valley, for people to understand, is that the Panjshir Valley is it's famous because the Soviets were never able to conquer the Panjshir Valley. Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was one of the leaders of the Northern Alliance, who was killed the day before 9/11 by Al Qaeda, and the Taliban in a suicide bombing, who then became known as the Lion of Panjshir. If people have seen photos or videos from Hamid Karzai International Airport, you will see these giant portraitures of a person who is not Hamid Karzai. That's Ahmad Shah Massoud. And he has been a martyr in the war against the Taliban for many of the people of Afghanistan. And so that's the Panjshir Valley, held out against the Soviets. The Taliban in the 90s were never able to conquer it. But in the span of a couple of weeks, with not much fighting, they took it. And this just goes to show how hollow, how fragile, how vacant the leadership of Afghanistan was. That the very men that the United States kept in power in Afghanistan for these last 20 years, that the United States sent its young people to go kill and be killed for, that we slaughtered Afghans for. Well, these men, as we have seen, have no legitimacy, have no popular support, cannot even maintain the control of their own forces as soon as American dollars disappear. And I think that is a really good example of how this war was always doomed. This is always going to be a house of cards. And even if it had been successful, right? We talk about the war as a failure, but I think we also need to talk about what was the United States trying to achieve? Even if the war had been successful, what it means is that these warlords just would have continued to control and brutalize Afghanistan. Again, basically you can look at it in the sense of for 2 decades now, the United States, through the barrel of a rifle, have given the Afghans two choices: either a theocratic repressive government via the Taliban, or a predatory kleptocratic government via these warlords, like the men like Amrullah Saleh, Ahmed Massoud, who is the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, Mohammed Ali Noor, Rashid Abdul Dostum, like these types, these warlords. And Anne has great familiarity with these men, and just how they are drug lords and war criminals.
So aside from the threat the CIA poses to the stability of Afghanistan, because they engage in these actions that do have an impact on the population, or can. We know that the CIA presence tends to have a destabilizing impact. Then there's the sanctions. There's the fact that we know that the Biden administration are turning toward freezing the humanitarian aid, freezing assets that could be in the possession of the Taliban to use in running this government that they're going to have to attempt to form in the coming weeks and months. And then there's IMF and World Bank aid that has been put on hold, being obstructed, that the U.S. is using as leverage very openly. But this was part of Biden's speech when he put the exclamation point on ending the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, the U.S. military occupation of Afghanistan. He spoke about this economic warfare. And I recall that back in July when we spoke to you, Anne, you warned that this was something that activists and people who were against this war needed to be against because of the impact that it could have on the Afghan people. So I'd like to go to you first, Anne, and to talk about what is going on with the freezing of aid to Afghanistan and its effect.
Well, it has turned out to be true that is the warfare the U.S. has decided to continue, not military warfare as such, but economic warfare. And the amount of money, the $7 billion that of Afghan money that was held in the United States, put there by the previous government, is still impounded, still frozen. The U.S. has put pressure on the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, not to release funds that normally would be coming to the government of Afghanistan, the Ashraf Ghani government, which was to be used to pay salaries, to pay this and that, mostly in salaries. And as Matt has said, government employees have not been paid for several months, which one would say, well, why weren't they? Because the international community was giving money into the Ashraf Ghani government, so why weren't they giving it out? And it speaks to the corruptness of those governments. I wrote a letter to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and whether or not he ever got it, or whether if he got it, if he read it, but the whole point was that we, the U.S., needed to continue a diplomatic presence inside Afghanistan, that we needed to keep that embassy open, certainly drawing down on people in terms of the numbers that we had there, but we needed to keep it open as a symbol that we care for the people of Afghanistan, not necessarily that we care for the Taliban government. But if we want the people of Afghanistan who have suffered so greatly through the U.S. military war and occupation on Afghanistan, then we need to have people on the ground to help interpret what's happening. The Taliban, during the 5 years from 1996 to 2001 that they were in power, they did not go into the U.S. Embassy compound. I know that for sure because when we got there in December of 2001, you could see that nobody really had been in the main part of the embassy. Our local national staff had done a really good job of keeping common criminals out of the compound. The only thing that really had come into it was a rocket or two where the Mujahideen, the militias, were fighting among themselves and rocketing different parts of Kabul, and one of the rockets inadvertently hit the U.S. Embassy compound and opened up a small hole where dust came in, and there you could see there was piles of dust everywhere, and you could have seen the footprints if somebody had been in, but they hadn't. The Taliban had not tried to break into the embassy. And the Taliban has already given assurances to the diplomatic community that they will respect the diplomatic immunity, the diplomatic sanctity of the compounds, and they're not going to be marauding into the massive, big U.S. Embassy compound that developed in the 20 years that we've been there. In the very beginning, all we had was a chancery building and a dugout, a little tunnel bunker, and that's what we, the first team of diplomats that went in to reopen it, that's where we lived, inside an underground bunker that had been built by our local employees so that they would have a place to get out of the way if the militias were firing rockets. But now that compound has grown to a massive, massive number of buildings, to include apartment buildings where some of the over 4,000 U.S. employees lived. So it is a very important symbol of U.S. concern for the people of Afghanistan. And while the U.S. has not officially said that it's closing the embassy, it says it's just suspending operations, and operations will take place through the U.S. Embassy staff that will be located in Doha. I've been a part of something like that when we had to evacuate our embassy in Sierra Leone in 1997 because of a civil war in Sierra Leone, and we had our embassy operations running out of the neighboring country, Guinea, and out of Washington. So this would not be the first time that this has been done, but there's no substitute for having people on the ground to be able to have contact with whatever government is in power and trying to broker deals to allow U.S. programs that are for the real benefit of the people of Afghanistan, health, education, and probably some propping up of government salaries for a while to continue. The Taliban does have its own source of revenue. It's been involved in the opium trade ever since it's been out of power. You know, when it was in power from 96 to 2001, the Taliban said, we do not participate in the drug funneling into Europe. We're not making money off of it, although I'm not too sure I believe all of that, but it has been since the U.S. military on the ground in Afghanistan, where Afghanistan has exploded in the amount of poppy production and heroin production that goes all over the world. So there are some sources of revenue that it has, but the international aid funds that should be coming in for the people of Afghanistan must be restarted.
Yeah, I mean, the Taliban are in a very difficult position right now. You know, it's something like 90% of the Afghan government spending came from foreign sources. You know, there's just no revenue in Afghanistan to support government functions, to support services to the people. And the Taliban are in a very difficult place. You know, as Ann said, with the drug trade, it is the only industry in Afghanistan. It provides something like 40% of Afghan GDP comes from the drug trade or something like that. You know, I mean, like you know, after 20 years, the only industry that Afghanistan has after this occupation is the narcotics business. And if the Taliban are sincere in saying in their statements that they're going to, again, curtail and eradicate that drug trade, what is going to happen to the millions and millions of Afghans who live off of that? Again, remember, 70% of Afghans live on less than $1 a day. You know, 90% live below the poverty line of $2 a day. You're talking about a country that is where you know, of the 40 million people, you know, 70% are living in a subsistence manner, you know, where starvation is a real threat daily. So, you know, what are the Taliban can do? And, you know, it comes back to like what are going to be the intentions of the United States. You can see what the United States can do in terms of this evacuation. And again, in the space of 10 days in the middle of a city conquered by an enemy, you know, off of one runway, the United States evacuated 120,000 people. I mean, that's amazing. I don't know if people get that. You know how like the mass of that, the what was accomplished. And so you can see what the United States, with all its resources, can do. The problem is that the intentions are never good. The intentions are never just or correct or benevolent. You've got to remember the United States government, the Pentagon specifically, they have a doctrine called money as a weapon system. So the United States government is never spending money doing development work, helping people for anything other than to achieve its own political and military objectives. And so, you have this very real danger of the Afghan people being in the situation they are now, which is unimaginable to pretty much all of us, here in this country, in the United States. But the situation actually could get worse, and then winter is coming. It's whether or not the Biden administration will choose to do the right and just thing, or will continue with this war by other means. We'll see. But I sure hope that Secretary Blinken read Ann's letter and maybe learned something from it.
Mm-hmm. And so as we wind down, I want to thank you both for your time. It's not lost on me that we have you, Matt, and you're an anti-war voice, or at least a voice for peace, for policies that move us closer to peace in your work. And then, Anne, of course, you're also that same kind of a voice, but you're involved as well with Code Pink, and you've done organizing, and it's to your credit that you've been someone who's out there challenging those in power and engaged in activism over the last 15 to 20 years around these wars that we've seen, these wars of occupation, which it really does seem like we're finally seeing within our political establishment, that they're moving away from occupations, but then they're turning towards this thing of over the horizon capabilities, how they can launch drone strikes. And we saw in the last week that the drone strike that was launched in response to the ISIS-K attack ended up killing someone who it seems wasn't actually an ISIS member, but in fact his entire family was eliminated, and it looks like he was part of some nonprofit organization. And so we have that tragedy to include in the end of the Afghanistan war, the withdrawal from the Afghanistan war. So I ask you a rather complex question, one that probably could fill an entire episode, and maybe you may not like that I'm ending in this manner, but what does the anti-war movement take away from this? Is there any credit that they should give themselves for bringing about this moment, for pushing the Biden administration into a position where they could not walk away from this withdrawal? They could not extend this war, as Biden had said, into another decade. Is that something that the anti-war movement should celebrate? There's been a lot of tension around whether Biden deserves any credit. I don't know if we should give him credit, and obviously the issue with giving him credit being that there's still going to be some war continued by the U.S., whether it's economic or whether it's covert, and that'll happen in Afghanistan. But I still think that it's really a big deal that U.S. forces did withdraw from Afghanistan. So your thoughts as we conclude what really has been this rare opportunity over the last month to reflect on Afghanistan. And it's a window that I recognize is closing, that a month from now, 2 months from now, the population really won't want to have these conversations. Let's start with you, Matt, and then you can give your final thoughts, and we'll let you have the final word.
Well, I've not seen any celebration in the anti-war community, the peace community. I mean, I've seen a lot of anger and sadness, a lot of anger over what has occurred, what may still occur, sadness over what has occurred, what may occur. So no celebration, just anger and sadness is the predominant feelings that I have, and from what I've seen from my friends and colleagues. Nobody is walking around saying "I told you so." There's no sense in that, and I don't think any of us are that type of person anyway. It is a big deal that the United States left Afghanistan, and I think we should be supporting Biden in whatever way possible, because he has taken a lot of political heat. He has been, I know someone who used to work with Joe Biden. Supposedly, Biden, when he was a senator, used to say, don't die on a small cross. And, Biden certainly chose a large cross here. The political fallout has been massive. And this is the political fallout that kept George Bush, that kept Barack Obama from doing any such things. This fear that you are going to be blamed for the next 9/11, that you will be called weak, that you will be called a traitor to those American soldiers who have now died in vain because of your decision. All these things are what kept Bush and Obama from doing anything like this. Trump is another animal, right? But so I think how can we support Biden, as well as the fact that, again, 76% as of today, 76% of Americans still support getting out of Afghanistan. So he does have the public. The problem is he's got the entire media against him. He's got both Republicans and some Democrats trying to score points against him. And of course he's got the whole military industrial intelligence development complex as well against him. So how do we continue to support him to try and encourage him to continue to make decisions like this? I will say that the loss of Afghanistan was big for the American empire. Losing these bases is huge. The humiliation of it. I don't subscribe to any notion that somehow America has lost credibility, because I don't think America has much credibility outside of the American media networks that ask that question all the time, and the right-wing governments in Europe who want to be junior imperial partners. But I think so. I think the loss was big, though, and I don't think what I was going to say is I don't think it's going to encourage other jihadist groups, or it's not going to encourage Iran, or it's not going to encourage Hamas or any of this other nonsense you hear. They're already encouraged. They already have, their own battles they're fighting. They don't need encouragement any more than they have. But the idea we have to understand is that starting in the Obama administration, the United States began hiding its wars. So where the Afghan war really was an outlier, with these major bases, with a fairly large American overt presence, in Iraq, we still have that to a degree. Hardly gets talked about, but still do. But the rest of the American wars in the Muslim world, from west coast of Africa to Pakistan, really are fought in a hidden manner, utilizing CIA special operations, drones, contractors, and proxy forces, government or militia, to keep these wars hidden from the American public, the American Congress, and the American media. I mean, we can recognize how successful that is, because remember in 2017, when 4 Green Berets were killed in Niger, someone like Senator Lindsey Graham didn't even know there were U.S. forces in Niger, let alone 1,000 of them, or how many there were. And Lindsey Graham, of course, being one of the most pro-military, hawkish members of Congress, if anyone would have been briefed upon this, it would have been Lindsey Graham. He would have been one of the ones to know about this. So you can see how well they can keep these wars hidden off the front pages, away from the politicians, even the supportive politicians, and that allows the wars to keep continuing, and the empire to continue to try and exert control.
I think the anti-war movement should take some credit. We don't have to crow about it, as Matt said, but it has been a continued program for 20 years. We've got to stop these wars. We've got to stop killing people around the world. Certainly the condition of women and things like that were things that people in the anti-war movement were very concerned about. But when you're killing more people than you're helping, that's one way to look at it. And I think the continued pushing in the peace and justice communities, pushing on our congressmen and women, saying, you just can't let these wars go on. You've got to stop creating them to start with. And Barbara Lee being the only person that voted against military operations in Afghanistan, and now we have 20 years later, we've got a whole crop of new congressmen and women who are really challenging the use of military operations by the United States, and are challenging the massive military budget that keeps expanding. So the peace community, the anti-war community, still has a lot on its plate to try to keep reducing, although we're not being successful. Our congressmen and women keep voting for larger military budgets. The issue of whether or not we're going to be able to prevent the next war. I mean, the Biden administration, now that they've been able to say, okay, we're out of Afghanistan, no more troops in Afghanistan, so we're going to pivot toward Asia and the Pacific, and we're really going to go after China. And I'm sitting out here in Honolulu, Hawaii, where the Indo-Pacific Command is, and the number of military war maneuvers that are going on in the Western Pacific, in the South China Sea, with lots and lots and lots of U.S. naval armadas out there, lots of military ships out there, a lot of U.S. fighter aircraft that are up and down from South Korea through Japan, Okinawa, down to Guam. It's a very dangerous place. So we're seeing that the Biden administration is kind of saying, shoo, we're out of there. No, we don't have to spend $300 million a day there, but we've got a huge military budget still, so we're going to go after China, and then we're going after Russia. So while I think we, as the anti-war community, we're very good about continuing to educate the American public about assassin drones and the effect on the people of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and Iraq and in Syria. We still have a lot on our plate. I wouldn't say that we are claiming at all that we were the reasons why finally the Biden administration, after 4 administrations having conducted the war in Afghanistan, that it was our position that really got them out of there. Although as Matt said, the statistics on the number of Americans who say we shouldn't be in there anymore, that it really was a lot of our education that helped them move along to that point of view.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question. I mean, I didn't ask the question to celebrate and have an insensitive amount of jubilation that didn't acknowledge there's still suffering and despair going on in Afghanistan, that we've left a country in total ruin, and that if it becomes a failed state, it will be our fault if in their effort to rebuild their government, they're not able to put together something that is able to sustain human life, that it will be our responsibility. Another country will put on the list, add it to Libya and other places in which we've had such a devastating impact. But to say that 76%, that around thereabouts of those people that are composed, let's say, of libertarians on the right and maybe people who are actually mainstream conservative and who have soured on the war and investing in it, and then the left and progressives and people who have been against this for some time, but maybe weren't willing to vote against Democrats in order to assert an end to that Afghanistan war. It actually seems like on the right, there have been people who have been much more willing to oppose Republicans who supported the war when compared to the progressive left. But just to say that transformation, that shift from where we were 2001 to 20 years from to today, where we are right now, to say that really doesn't happen without veterans like Matthew who are speaking, and without people like you and that are speaking, that people aren't getting this. Obviously, they're not getting this from our media. They're not getting this from the entertainment they're consuming necessarily. They could in some isolated places. They're not getting this from their politicians. So they must be getting this from people who have actually experienced the war. They must be getting this from the people who are writing critically and actually do understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. If I could add one more thing, I don't give Trump much credit for anything, but 2 things. One, he did meet with Kim Jong-un 3 times, and that nobody else would do that. He was willing to take the heat from his own party and from everybody else. The second thing was that he said, I am going to follow through on my campaign promise that we've got to end the country's longest war and we will get a peace agreement. Now, the way that it ended up, I think we all disagree with just having a peace agreement with one element of the situation, only the Taliban, and saying to the government of Afghanistan, oh, screw you, we're just getting whatever we can and we're getting out. But nobody else was willing to do that. And he has, Trump has took a lot of heat within his own party for even having discussions with the Taliban. So I'll give him credit for that. It wasn't done the way it should have been done, but if it hadn't started with that, we would still be having at least 25, well, we would have had still probably the 8,500 U.S. military that were in there before the drawdown started to actually reach 2,500, which was the last remaining part that came out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, the Taliban still would have done this offensive. I mean, if the negotiation had not occurred, this Taliban offensive would have occurred regardless. And what would have happened was the Americans would have been in the middle of it, would have had to commit more forces, would have killed a lot more Afghans. The Taliban probably would have been successful capturing some provincial cities, some border crossings, some road networks, etc. But it would have just been, you would have been back to the violence in the ferocity of the war that had existed, say, in 2010. That was where this would have gone if there were no negotiations. The Taliban were not going to wait. I mean, anyone who thinks that is just, but also, but to Ann's point, I think there's been a lot of really great education done by a lot of people, including people who listen to shows like this, who listen and watch shows like this, and then turn around and say to their family and friends, hey, have you thought about this? So I think a lot of this has just become from because of people like you and Rania. Kevin, I thought about this. So in 2009, when I had all my celebrity and I was on the Today Show and with Judy Woodruff and Fareed Zakaria, all that stuff, right? Back then there were podcasts, but not like this. You had to go to a studio or you did something on a telephone. I remember at one point a group called Brave New Films out in California in 2009. They and they did a great thing called Rethink Afghanistan. Which I actually watched when I was in Afghanistan, and remember thinking, holy crap, these guys are exactly right. But I remember they had they wanted my video. They wanted a video of me, like a 10-minute video of me. And this is in November 2009. So the way they did it was they FedExed me a laptop with a video camera attached to it overnight. I taped the thing and I FedExed it back to them. Because in 2009, we're on StreamYard now, but Skype, we had Skype. It wasn't the way it is now. We certainly didn't have Zoom. So the point being is that we didn't have podcasts like yours and Rania. You didn't have these forums where people could come on and talk for an hour and a half, and really get into details. In 2009, long form journalism was still a 15-minute hit on NPR, or a 20-minute piece of 60 minutes or something like that. That punctuated by advertisements. That was long-form journalism. And so a lot of credit has to go to people like yourselves who have been doing this journalism and really getting into the issues and really educating people so that people then can turn to their friends, family, coworkers, classmates and say, well, hey, have you thought about this? And I think that's how you get to the point where 76% of the Americans say, yeah, getting out of Afghanistan was the right thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. And thank you, Ann, for joining this episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. And we'll be back next week with another show. Once again, here's a reminder to support the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by going to our Patreon or Rockfin, or finding us on Spotify. On Patreon, we're at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. On Rockfin, you can subscribe to our channel at rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. And on Spotify, all you have to do is find our show, Unauthorized Disclosure, and become a paid subscriber. Each of these ways get you access to full episodes of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and it helps us keep producing this independent show. Thank you. We'll be back soon with more Unauthorized Disclosure.